Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. My name is Evan Torres. I'm a structural engineer with the US Army Corps of Engineers, stationed at Kirtland Air Force Base, just southeast of Albuquerque. When the klaxon sounded, I thought it was another test. We get them all the time. Fire drills, lockdowns, chemical response protocols. But this time, the alert tone was different, deeper, longer. And when I checked my phone, the screen was glowing red with a line of all caps text. Emergency alert, unidentified arachnid infestation. All personnel report to hazmat bunkers immediately. For a moment, I thought it was a cyber attack or a prank. But then, I saw the convoy of military vehicles heading west down Gibson Boulevard toward the Sandia Labs perimeter, their blue strobes piercing the dawn haze. When you've worked with infrastructure long enough, especially in defense and aerospace installations, you learn that anything labeled unidentified in a top-level bulletin isn't something to ignore. So I grabbed my go bag, threw on my composite boots and field jacket, and locked up my apartment. I didn't know it then, but I wouldn't be back. By the time I reached the underground operations shelter beneath Building 805, most of the engineering and logistics teams were already inside. Lieutenant Commander Dana Reeves, a logistics officer with the 377th Air Base Wing, handed me a respirator and a radio before sealing the hatch behind me. "Whatever this is," she said, "it's not local. There's something moving under the soil out by the East Mesa. Something big." Kirtland sits in the middle of a sensitive zone, home to everything from nuclear fuel storage to drone research. The eastern boundary touches the edge of the Manzano Mountains, and just beyond that lies the Cibola National Forest, remote, rocky, and practically untouched. I'd hiked it plenty of times before. It never seemed threatening. That changed within 12 hours. By mid-morning, I was reassigned from my usual inspection duties to a rapid deployment unit, Task Force Osprey. We weren't frontline troops. We were engineers, geologists, and communications specialists. Our objective was to secure and map a section of access tunnels, old Cold War-era crawl spaces that threaded beneath the labs and extended towards Sandia Crest. Those tunnels had recently gone dark. We loaded up with PPE, portable seismographs, and thermal imaging drones. Our team lead, Dr. Lena Aurora, was a civilian entomologist under contract, brilliant and calm under pressure. She looked worried, said she'd seen heat signatures underground that didn't match anything native. The deeper the probe went, the more erratic the data became. Spike readings like short bursts of microwave heat, then nothing. She thought it might be thermal venting or unstable gas pockets. I wish it had been. We descended through Access Tunnel 6A, a steel-reinforced vertical shaft that opens into a forgotten maintenance corridor about 200 feet underground. I remember the air changing immediately, metallic, dry. My Geiger counter gave off occasional soft clicks, normal, given the proximity to the Sandia test grid, nothing alarming. We made it about 300 meters in before we heard it, a rhythmic scraping, not mechanical, not human. "Could be seismic settling," I said, but it wasn't. The first contact happened at 14:23 hours. Private Jenkins, one of the security attachments from the 58th Special Operations Wing, spotted a large hole in the concrete floor, about 4 feet wide, jagged around the edges, as if something had torn upward rather than collapsed inward. Lena moved in to take readings. Then we saw movement. A leg, long, thin, black, snapped up from the hole like a whip and wrapped around Jenkins' ankle. He shouted, stumbled back, and opened fire. The muzzle flashes lit the tunnel in bursts of white and red, revealing a nightmarish shape surging up from below. It was an arachnid, but not any species I recognized. Its body was dull and scaled, not shiny like most spiders. Its legs were segmented and muscular, jointed at odd angles, But the most disturbing part was its size, at least 5 feet tall when it fully emerged, and the eyes, clustered, glistening, and somehow focused. Jenkins managed to wound it. The bullet slowed it down. Not enough. It shrieked, not a sound spiders make, higher, piercing, like glass fracturing. We pulled him back, sealed the shaft with a breaching charge, and retreated to surface level. By the time we got there, the sky had darkened, not from clouds, but from ash and particulate matter. Something was burning near to Harris Canyon. I knew then that this wasn't an isolated event. Back at the command center, the picture became clearer, horrifically so. Satellite recon showed dozens of new heat signatures emerging across the East Mesa, clustered around fault lines and dry riverbeds. Albuquerque's east side had already lost power. Reports were coming in from civilians, giant insects, collapsing roads, screams underground. Entire neighborhoods were being evacuated, some too late. What we were seeing wasn't natural, not a species mutating due to climate or radiation. This was coordinated. An infestation, yes, but with patterns. Lena pulled me aside and showed me an overlay of the infestation zones compared with 1970s uranium test boreholes. The match was almost perfect. They were dormant, she whispered, for decades, maybe longer. I stared at the map. There were red X's from the base of the Sandias all the way up to Santa Fe's southern boundary. These aren't animals, Evan, she said. They're colonizers. By midnight, the Federal Emergency Management Zone had been activated. Kirtland AFB became a staging ground. Interstate 40 was shut down. The Sandia Lab's perimeter was under full blackout. I joined a team preparing to reinforce the Rio Grande flood wall. We weren't just trying to contain them. We were trying to keep something in. Ground-penetrating radar had detected several tunnel systems running westward, toward the city's center. If they got under downtown Albuquerque, we'd lose the whole grid. We used Semtex to collapse abandoned sewer junctions near Central Avenue. National Guard units fortified the UNM campus as a fallback zone, but the creatures were moving faster than we could act. By the time we sealed one tunnel, another would open 5 miles away. They were using the aquifer system to travel. Lena theorized that they didn't need oxygen the way surface creatures do. Some form of anaerobic respiration, maybe even chemosynthesis. It didn't make sense. Nothing about them did. Not their speed, their size, their intelligence. But the worst part came when we captured one. At 3:06, Task Force Sierra intercepted and downed a smaller specimen near Eubank Boulevard. We studied it under full containment at the base biology lab. It wasn't an arachnid in the traditional sense, more like an evolutionary offshoot. Its blood was copper-rich, blue when oxygenated. Its muscle fibers had crystallized strands of an unknown protein. It had no vocal cords, yet it could produce sound. No eyes, yet it navigated with terrifying precision. No reproductive organs, but rows of egg sacs embedded in its thorax. A hive system, maybe even a queen. Somewhere. That's when the advisory level was raised to Redcon 1. Evan, Lena told me, this isn't an outbreak, this is a breach. They came in waves. I remember standing on the roof of the Sandia Lab parking structure, watching the East Mesa shimmer under floodlights. The ground seemed to ripple. Then the surface collapsed in dozens of spots like termite mounds erupting in reverse. Hundreds of them surged up and out, different sizes, different speeds. There was no hesitation, no pause to assess or regroup. They poured forward in a synchronized swarm, legs slicing through the dust like bone saws, moving with inhuman rhythm. The creatures didn't scramble aimlessly, they flowed in coordinated waves, fanning out toward the perimeter fence, probing weak points, leaping over Jersey barriers and chain link like they'd been trained for it. The floodlights, mounted on hydraulic masts and spaced at 30-meter intervals, flickered and dimmed under the strain. A few went out completely, as if something were interfering with the power grid. The first heavy weapons opened up from the Western Guard posts. The rhythmic thump of the Mark 19 grenade launchers echoed across the compound. lobbing 40 high explosive rounds into the advancing mass. Flashes of fire lit up the night like a strobe, each detonation tearing through clusters of limbs and scattering chitinous fragments across the tarmac. But for every creature that dropped, more kept coming. They didn't retreat. They didn't break ranks. They surged over their own dead. Behind me, the roof shook as the M2 Browning on the south tower opened up, raking a line of tracer fire down the hill. I could see the operator, Staff Sergeant Harlan, his silhouette jerking with each recoil. Spent casings poured down the fire escape like metallic rain. Further down the slope, several of the larger arachnids, easily the size of deer, leapt onto the side of an armoured utility truck and tore through the passenger window with their front legs. The vehicle lurched as something inside exploded, and black smoke began to billow from its engine block. Someone on the ground screamed, then another. I backed away from the roof's edge and turned toward the stairwell. Commander Reeves was waiting by the door, shouting into a handset. Her voice was sharp, urgent. The backup diesel generators were online. But 2 sectors had already lost feed to the smart fence grid. That meant the eastern barrier, the only thing between us and the Cibola wilderness, was going blind. "They're bypassing the fencing," she told me without looking up. "Not breaching bypassing tunneling underneath the EM field. They knew exactly where the wiring junctions were." She didn't have to spell it out. That kind of targeting wasn't instinct. It wasn't animal behavior. It was intelligence. Strategic movement, systematic disabling of infrastructure. We were no longer dealing with a mutation or freak evolution. We were fighting an invasive force that had likely been observing us from underground for decades, maybe longer. We evacuated the upper facilities by 3 o'clock. Every non-combat personnel was directed towards Zone Red Bravo, an underground launch shelter originally built during the Reagan era, now repurposed for CBRN containment. I helped escort a team of civilian scientists and technicians through the flood access tunnel, connecting the Sandia cooling station to the south bank of the Kirtland perimeter. The passage, a reinforced concrete pipe large enough to drive a small truck through, had been retrofitted with LED emergency strips and biometric locks. It felt like moving through the body of some massive machine, cold and vibrating with distant impacts. As we reached the final checkpoint, the radio crackled with updates from the city. Albuquerque was beginning to fall. The eastern neighborhoods of Four Hills and Singing Arrow had gone dark completely. The transmission substations near Eubank Boulevard were compromised. Several homes collapsed as the ground beneath them gave way. Tunnel breaches opening directly into residential blocks. Civilians were trapped, and local emergency services were overwhelmed. The National Guard had established a temporary triage center at the University of New Mexico Hospital, but incoming calls were down to a trickle. What little footage we saw, mostly drone captures and traffic cams, showed the swarm moving down Central Avenue, bypassing barricades, dismembering vehicles in seconds. Downtown would not hold. It was shortly after dawn when we lost communication with the Albuquerque Police Department's central dispatch. Their last message was a scrambled burst of digital telemetry, followed by a partial voice fragment. "Underground. They're inside the vaults, shrieking, 'We can't block the vents.'" Then silence. From that moment, the containment strategy shifted. No longer were we trying to save the city. Now the objective was to prevent the infestation from crossing the Rio Grande. A full aerial interdiction plan was authorized. MQ-9 Reapers, loaded with AGM-114 Hellfire missiles and 500-pound GBU-38 JDAMs, were dispatched from Holloman Air Force Base. We watched from a portable SAT terminal as the first strike hit the Sandia Crest Ridge, vaporizing a cluster of tunnels exposed near the summit. The detonation registered on the USGS seismic net as a 2.4 magnitude event. Dust clouds rose thousands of feet into the air, visible even from our underground shelter. It felt like a victory, briefly. But 2 hours later, new breaches were detected near Corrales and Rio Rancho west of the river. That meant the creatures had already passed under the city and were surfacing on the far side. It meant we were surrounded. By noon, The Army Corps of Engineers issued an immediate structural evacuation order for the Montano Bridge, the Rio Bravo overpass, and the Corps Boulevard levees. I was reassigned to the Rio Grande Flood Control Project, Task Force Delta 5. We loaded up with drilling gear, geophone rigs, ground-penetrating radar, and det cord. Our job was to identify possible breach vectors along the levee wall and seal them before the hive could spread westward into the agricultural zones and wildlife corridors of the Bosque. The Bosque was an ecological time capsule, a lush, cottonwood-lined oasis in the high desert. If the infestation reached it, there would be no way to stop its spread through the wildlife. That meant containment would fail. Our team worked in 2 shifts, round the clock, setting up seismic detection pods every 200 meters along the river's eastern bank. We picked up subterranean tremors almost immediately. Deep, rhythmic, slow, not tectonic, not human, something else, something alive. I set up a borehole camera with Alvarez, another field engineer, and we lowered it down through the silt and bedrock to a depth of 15 meters. What we saw turned my stomach. The soil wasn't just displaced, it was constructed, shaped into chambers and conduits, reinforced with a strange fibrous resin, not unlike spider silk. But the scale was enormous. This wasn't just a hive, it was a colony network the size of a city block, interlaced with passageways and egg chambers pulsing with faint bioluminescence. We drilled directly into one of their birthing zones. We sealed the hole with thermite and prayed that it was enough. As dusk fell over Albuquerque for the second time since the alert, we received word from NORAD. Satellite thermal mapping now showed multiple hotspots across New Mexico, Los Lunas, Socorro, even as far south as Alamogordo. The infestation was moving outward along the state's major aquifer routes and geological fault lines. They weren't random, they were following the water. It made a horrific kind of sense. The Rio Grande Rift was a natural superhighway beneath the desert, lined with aquifers and faulted rock. If they were using geothermal energy and subsurface moisture to sustain themselves, then the entire Rio corridor, from Colorado to Texas, was at risk. By midnight, evacuation orders were extended to Santa Fe and parts of Las Cruces. Our lines began to thin. Soldiers weren't just getting overrun, they were disappearing during recon missions, their body cams going dark without warning. The implication was clear. The Arachnids were intercepting patrols, learning their patterns, adapting their attacks. They were hunting us. The kill zones around Albuquerque's eastern perimeter were no longer holding. Trenches dug 2 days ago were overrun by morning. Listening posts near Interstate 25 were silent, with only residual heat signatures and scattered biometric tags left behind. Forward operating teams couldn't reach their own rally points. Entire platoons were wiped off the tactical grid in hours. The creatures were avoiding direct conflict now, engaging only in isolation, choosing their moments. That's what made it worse. It meant they knew the value of surprise, of fear, of exhaustion. By the time my orders came through to descend into Vault 13, a black site facility buried beneath Kirtland's secondary munitions range, 3 separate command layers had gone dark. We were no longer coordinating with NORAD or Fort Carson. The Joint Ops Center had issued its last known communique 6 hours prior, a partial directive fragment signed off by someone only known to us by clearance code Echo Grey. It wasn't a name or rank I recognized. That alone was unsettling. The vault lay beneath a reinforced shell of pre-stressed concrete and steel, sealed since the late 1970s. Officially, the site had been decommissioned in 1985. I'd seen the files myself back when I was contracted as a civil engineer for base improvements, but those documents were sanitized. The real site went deeper, 5 levels down, below the known structure, carved directly into volcanic bedrock using plasma cutters and directional blasting. No blueprints existed past level 2. What lay beneath had been hidden for decades, not only from the public, but from most of the military itself. My escort consisted of 4 personnel: Lieutenant Ramirez from Base Security, geophysicist Dr. Haruto Sakamoto from the Earth Sciences Division, biohazard technician Nicole Weber, and Lena, who was carrying 2 sealed canisters of live specimen material. We rode down in a steel freight elevator powered by an isolated diesel genset. It vibrated with an uneven hum as we passed the known infrastructure. The walls shifted from reinforced paneling to raw, unmarked stone. Conduits disappeared. Lights flickered. The temperature dropped steadily, even though the geothermal readings in the area suggested the opposite. At level 5, the doors opened to reveal a corridor choked in dust and untouched for what had to be 30 years. A collapsed rolling gate had been forced inward, likely by seismic activity or structural fatigue, but the steel was bent in the wrong direction, as if something had pushed it open from the inside. That set the tone for everything that followed. The air smelled stale but dry, not mouldy, not decomposing, sterile in a way that didn't match the environment. Weber swept for spores and airborne pathogens, but her sensor returned clean. That only made her more uneasy. Something had scrubbed this space chemically, or it had never been biologically active to begin with. We pushed deeper. Dr. Sakamoto activated the subsurface scanner. Its pulses came back irregularly. The density of the surrounding rock kept shifting in ways that didn't make geological sense. Sections of stone showed signs of rapid thermal stress and regrowth. Heat-blasted voids now resealed with obsidian-like lattice. It was as though something had tunneled through magma, hardened the walls behind it, and moved on. The deeper we went, the clearer it became. This facility had been built around something already there. At 113 meters below surface, we reached the chamber. There was no door, just a jagged opening where rock had split and curved inward unnaturally. Not a cave, not a fault crack. The angles were too smooth, too deliberate. We had to crouch to enter, squeezing between sheets of metamorphic stone that had been scorched, reshaped, and fused. The rock surface was glassy and warm to the touch, humming faintly with electromagnetic feedback. I could feel it in my teeth. And then the walls widened. We emerged into a subterranean dome, roughly 40 meters wide and 12 meters high, lined with silicate deposits that refracted light like broken crystal. At the far end was an object, partially embedded in the floor, partially suspended on an impossible tilt. It wasn't metal in any traditional sense. Its surface shimmered like beetle chitin, matte black with faint green iridescence when the flashlight beam struck it just right. It was not made by any known tool. There were no seams, no welds, no fasteners, and it was not inert. Dr. Sakamoto stared in silence. His scanner read a consistent background pulse, 74 Hz, rhythmically stable, mimicking a low-frequency heartbeat. Weber's biometer detected no organic content. Lena stepped forward, staring at it like she'd seen it in a dream, and maybe she had. The pressure in the room intensified, not physically, but mentally. My ears rang, my heart beat too fast. My throat dried out instantly, as if the air around this object resisted human presence. It wasn't threatening, it was aware. Ramirez held position at the rear, radio silent. His hand stayed near his rifle, but he didn't raise it. There was something sacred about this chamber. Not religious, primeval, something too old to be understood, and we were trespassing. Then the chamber ceiling above us trembled. Dust rained down. Weber looked up. Dr. Sakamoto glanced at the seismic readout. Fresh motion, shallow, multiple points, movement patterns not consistent with tectonic vibration. Then we heard it. The now familiar scraping noise, but faster, closer. From above, they followed us down here, Lena said quietly. And that's when the lights went out. The emergency headlamps kicked in with a delay of 4 seconds. In that time, I heard 3 distinct sounds. The snap of something tearing through rebar, the guttural shriek of inhuman vocal cords, and the panicked shout of Ramirez as something wrenched him backward into the dark. By the time we turned, his rifle was on the ground and his radio was crackling static. The passage we came through had collapsed. The debris had not fallen in. It had been filled packed tightly. The arachnids had sealed our exit in under 30 seconds. That wasn't speed. That was coordination. We backed toward the object in the center of the chamber, forming a defensive ring. I grabbed Ramirez's weapon and chambered a fresh round. Sakamoto held the seismic probe like a spear. Weber drew her sidearm but kept her other hand gripping the specimen canister. Lena had already opened the secondary case and activated a small remote array. Biometric relays, micro-drone pods, and a proximity flare charge. It wasn't a weapon, but it would buy us time. The tunnel beyond the chamber echoed with clicks and dry rustling sounds. It wasn't just motion, it was communication. They were talking to each other. A few seconds later, the first one came into view. It wasn't the largest I'd seen, roughly the size of a wolf, but it moved in a way that suggested observation, not attack. It stopped short of the chamber threshold and tapped one leg against the floor 3 times. Behind it, I saw more eyes, rows of them, glowing faintly blue-green, clustered along the tunnel ceiling. They didn't charge, they watched. That was when the object in the center of the room responded. It pulsed once. A low hum rose from its surface, not audible so much as felt. My vision blurred around the edges. Sakamoto dropped to his knees. The floor beneath us shook, and the refractions on the wall shifted. Symbols appeared along the object's hull. No alphabet I recognized, no writing system known to man, but they conveyed meaning anyway. What I felt was this: arrival, release, expansion, not words, concepts, a transmission not meant for ears but minds. The arachnids did not enter the chamber. They waited, and then they retreated. The tunnel beyond the threshold cleared within seconds. The scratching faded. The silence returned. Whatever this structure was, it held authority over them, and it had just chosen to reveal itself. It took us 6 hours to dig a side tunnel with manual tools and exit through a service duct that led into a sub-level of the weapons testing bunker near the Sandia perimeter. By the time we emerged, the facility above had already been evacuated. Only 2 personnel remained to greet us, a drone pilot and a medic. Everyone else had pulled back westward, across the river. Albuquerque was lost. The city behind us was burning. From the rooftop of the west bunker, you could see the thick, oily smoke rolling over the skyline like a black tide. Flames reached up from collapsed buildings in the heights, and what little of the downtown grid still had power flickered dimly in the haze. Sirens no longer howled. Helicopters were gone. The last convoy out of the Kirtland zone had left 4 hours earlier under heavy escort, weaving through sandbagged intersections and makeshift blockades. Their destination was the temporary field base established at Isleta Pueblo, south of the river, near the rail junctions. That base, too, would be temporary. None of the fallback lines were designed to last. We were buying time, that was all. They didn't want us rejoining the others. The drone pilot, a quiet man in his late 30s wearing a sweat-stained uniform and darkened goggles, handed us water and a folded packet of satellite maps. He didn't say much, didn't need to. His station was already half disassembled, the control consoles disconnected and pushed against the wall. The medic, Staff Sergeant Dalia Mendez, checked us for infection, exposure, trauma. Her gloves were trembling when she inspected the canister Weber carried. Lena wasn't with us anymore. She had been separated under executive command the moment we transmitted data from the vault. They didn't even allow us to speak to her after. A black, unmarked chopper landed on a nearby helipad and took her within an hour of our surface emergence. We had no destination, no assignment, no clearance. The most we could do was follow the river south, away from the ruined zone. Before we left, the drone operator handed me a USB stick. No label, no markings. This was from 2 days ago, he said. Classified feed from Holoman. They tracked an object before the outbreak, east of Carrizoso. We think it's related to what you saw down there. That night, we camped behind the remains of a burned-out commuter train just outside the Isleta marshes. The wind carried a chemical bite, a bitter tang of scorched insulation and ash. I watched the footage on my field laptop under a tarp lit with dim red LEDs. The video showed thermal imaging from an orbital surveillance pass. Ghost white outlines moving under the surface of the desert basin in a perfect geometric pattern. Hundreds of nodes, interconnected by what appeared to be tunnels or channels, laid out in a spiral lattice spanning miles. It wasn't natural, and it wasn't recent. The signature had been faint, traced only because it interfered with a classified radar calibration test. They'd known something was there, and they'd buried it. Dr. Sakamoto sat beside me, saying nothing for a long time. Then finally, he said, "They're not spreading, they're activating." He pulled out a notebook, thick with scribbled diagrams and seismic logs. These sites, Sandia, White Sands, Socorro, Fort Stanton, they follow the same substratum. Ancient volcanic collapse zones, magmatic tubes and salt domes. They didn't just dig into the earth, they were already here, buried, dormant. How long? He looked up. Hundreds of thousands of years, maybe longer. I didn't want to believe it, but it tracked with everything we had seen. The size of the underground structures, the intelligent coordination, the biochemistry that didn't match terrestrial life. It wasn't evolution, it was design, a species or force that had been waiting in silence, embedded deep within the Earth's crust, long before we built roads, satellites, even language. And now, something had triggered their return. The next morning, a scout drone from the Isleta base found us. It buzzed overhead, blinking its coded transponder, then dropped a data capsule on a thin mylar tether. Inside was a strip of printed paper, low-tech for redundancy, marked with a single-line message: Task Force Bastion, regrouping at Elephant Butte. Enlist with ground convoy. Sector clearance granted. Priority: biological sample protection. We joined a westbound evac convoy by mid-afternoon, riding in the back of a retrofitted fuel truck alongside refugees, airmen, and medical techs. The vehicle smelled like diesel, heat, and fear. People kept their voices low. Most of them had left family behind. One woman, an ICU nurse named Carla from Presbyterian Hospital, held a small girl close and stared out the slit window the entire ride. She never blinked. The road south was in bad shape. Potholes, debris, abandoned vehicles. At least a dozen cars had been torched along the shoulder, and several commercial semis lay jackknifed near the Socorro junction. We had to detour twice through dry arroyos to bypass blocked bridges. Every stop was quick, 10 minutes, tops. The creatures hadn't yet reached this far, but no one was taking chances. They moved underground, and the deeper south we went, the harder it became to detect them. Our seismic equipment couldn't penetrate the denser limestone and salt crusts along the Chihuahuan edge. That made them ghosts, silent until they surfaced. When we reached Elephant Butte, Sarsi, the sun was going down. The reservoir was dry. The lake bed, once sprawling and blue, now stretched out in cracked grey sheets under the twilight. Task Force Bastion had set up a hardened compound along the old State Park maintenance road, using prefab bunkers and radar trailers. At night, it looked like a mining colony on some alien planet. Wide area floodlights kept the perimeter lit like daylight, and sound triangulation towers blinked with infrared sensors on every side. We were escorted in, passed through decontamination, and directed to a temporary operations tent where the remaining field brass had gathered. Colonel Briggs, an older man with deep creases and a voice that carried over engines, greeted us without ceremony. He took the canister Weber carried, handed it off to an armored courier, and gestured for us to follow him to a map table. The digital terrain overlay displayed southern New Mexico, northwestern Texas, and the far edge of the Sonoran Basin. Multiple flashing red nodes traced a downward arc, spreading from Sandia toward Deming, Silver City, and beyond. We think we've identified a core hive structure, he said. Not the only one, but the biggest, located inside the Organ Mountains. The terrain there is fractured, full of obsidian dikes and folded basalt. There's a chasm, La Cueva de la Reina, that appears to be artificial, too symmetrical, too deep. He switched to a thermal overlay. 2 days ago, we detected this. A massive heat plume, shaped like a flower opening, flared on the screen, over 120 degrees Celsius at surface level. Estimated subterranean volume, 2 cubic kilometers. That's not a burrow, that's an underground city. We said nothing. Briggs tapped a smaller blinking light near Las Cruces. We've already lost drone feed south of here. Tunnels are collapsing in controlled patterns, like a wave front. What's the objective? I asked. Briggs hesitated. Then he zoomed out on the map, past New Mexico, past Arizona, past Texas. There's another site, he said, deeper than any of the others, under the basin and range near Death Valley. We believe it's the original source. Satellite data suggests it may predate the Ice Age, possibly older. The geological data doesn't match Earth formation. There's a hypothesis forming now that this isn't just ancient, it's extraterrestrial. He let that hang in the air. If it's true, he added, they didn't evolve here. They were placed as a seed, a failsafe, maybe a weapon, maybe a species that lost its home and buried itself here to wait for conditions to change. And what changed? Weber asked. Briggs answered without looking up. Us. The next operation was called Last Harvest, a multi-branch push into the Organ Mountains, deploying a penetrator warhead into the hive structure at La Cueva de la Reina, followed by detonation of a sub-nuclear bunker buster, something between a MOAB and a shaped fusion burst. It wasn't a strategic nuke, not officially, but the paperwork we saw bore Department of Energy seals, not defense. We were to assist with seismic mapping, structural reinforcement for the delivery shaft, and biological containment in case anything surfaced during the breach. They expected resistance. No one said it, but we all knew the same thing. This was not a military victory operation. It was a burial, again. The creatures had slept once before. Maybe we could make them sleep again. That was the hope. But it was only hope. We deployed at dawn, and deep beneath the earth, something listened. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.